context of colonialism, post-colonialism, and decolonization, decoloniality, as we would discuss in more depth very soon. Can you hear me properly, everybody? I know I tested with Manisha.
Yes,
everybody.
Dr.
Okay.
Yeah.
In case there is any issue, I'm not so text savvy because I'm Generation X, not millennial. So you can raise your hand and ask that question, right? You know how to raise the hand, right? The icon is there. I hope people can, you know how to do that. Or Manisha can guide you. Or Manisha can also take questions if there are questions in the chat box, right? Okay, so before I begin, I would also like to say this disclaimer, that is, we have to recognize that a subject like sociology, and I'm a sociologist by training, as you know, often deals with and often talks about controversial topics and issues, right? Topics and discussion of topics such as, race, racism, sex, sexism, right? Sexuality and all that, homophobia, which can often make people uncomfortable. Now, the goal of sociology, right, or what I'm going to say today, is not to make us uncomfortable, but when we try to grapple these controversial topics and issues, it is for the sake of deepening our understanding, right, to make us more aware. And of course, the bigger goal is, the long-term goal is, so that we can become aware, civic-minded global citizens, right? So I have also seen over the years, right, I have been teaching for the last 15 years in not just at King's, but before that at UBC, and for a brief period at Brandon University in Manitoba, which is close to you, right, in the central region of Canada, that often students get a bit anxious, right, when it comes to talking about controversial topics such as racism, colonialism, sexism. And the worry is about, am I going to say something that might offend the audience or the professor or, people who are with me and all that. But remember that, unsettling, some of our closely held beliefs, right? Questioning things which are taken for granted. These are all not only pedagogically valuable, but they are also socially valuable, because unless we are presented with controversial topics, unless we can, penetrate deeply into the problems of these controversies, roots of these controversies, histories of these controversies, we cannot develop the most important skill which we gain in doing higher education, right? Which is critical thinking, right? And critical thinking, critical understanding is important, not just to get, A grades or B grades and to score high points or to get a great job, but it's a lifelong skill which makes us great global citizens, right? Not just of Canada, but of the world, right? What I often try to do is when I'm trying to understand these kind of controversial topics, I try to over-explain, and I might do that today also. And I hope you would also find this method useful. Now, take a look at this postage stamp from Canada, which was actually made in 1898, right? So it was released December 25, 1898. I'm going to minimize this, that would help me. And you see, I believe you can see my pointer, right? It says, we hold a vaster empire than has been. So basically, it's portraying the great pride of the British Empire in late 19th century, that Britain, right, UK or England, now possesses, right, a vast empire across the different continents of Africa, Asia, America, and also Australia, New Zealand, right? You see here, and they are very proud of it, right? So you can see that this pride, this attitude, is at the core of coloniality, is at the core of what helped colonizers to consolidate their empire, right? That confidence, right? Of course, today in 2022. Nobody, right, in their sane mind can portray that kind of pride or attitude around the world. but that was a past perspective. To understand what led to that late 19th century big, proudful, boastful declaration, we do need to have a very brief overview of what happened at a very important, crucial juncture of European history, which has a great connection to world history and global history, especially how capitalism, globalization, and actually empire building spread following 1600 AD, that is 17th century. Okay, so I'll quickly read out from one important scholar of European colonialism of 17th century by the name of Horn, whose book came out in 2018. Please bear with me. He writes, the 17th century was a period when the roots of slavery, meaning Atlantic slavery, white supremacy, and capitalism became inextricably tangled into a complex history involving war, revolts in Europe, England's conquest of the Scots, meaning Scotland, and Ireland, the development of formidable new weapons, which made it possible for Western Europe, places, countries like England and France, to consolidate their colonial dominance, right, in Asia, Africa, and the Americas, right, and also the rebel merchants, right, the newly emerged, the newly minted, powerful capitalist class of merchants who sailed to North America, places like Canada, today's US, right, and they founded the United States and later Canada, right. And these aspirational merchants, these aspirational business class community would often portray themselves, and they would feel proud of it, that they are going to settle these unsettled land, right? Now they assume that nobody were living on those land, or whoever were living cannot be considered as equally human as they were, the Europeans, right? So they found that this free land amounted to combat pay for their efforts as white settlers. So, I mean, they were proud that they are settling these lands and they are bringing the light of civilization to this land. They are making this land productive by cultivating them. People who were there, first of all, through the prism of racial hierarchy, initially they were not seen as equally human, or even when they were considered to be human, they were placed at a lower rank or rung in that hierarchy of races. That was an important theory that came out especially in 19th century, which used to be called scientific racism, right? Whites at the top, right? Then came, the browns, and then yellows, and then blacks, and so on and so forth, right? But of course, today, that kind of scientific racism has been challenged, questioned, and rejected by the very fact that there are more genetic differences within a particular category of race than there are differences between two different categories of races, right? I hope I could make it understandable. So moving on to that important juncture of critical history in 1600 AD, we also see following that period that Europe, right, especially Western powers of Europe, such as England, France, right, initially, of course, Portugal and Spain, and then Dutch, Holland, England and France, they colonized parts of Africa, the New World, and Asia, right? And ultimately we see by 1860s, late 19th century, there were around 13 million Africans and some 5 million Native Americans, right, which we can call today indigenous people, who were forced to build and cultivate a society praising liberty and justice for all. Remember, European history, modern history, is built on the premise of enlightenment, which were again built on some important events such as Industrial Revolution, such as French Revolution, where the ideas of equality, justice, liberty, fraternity for all, not just for the Queen of France or the King of France, but for all, right? The idea of democracy. So, and this is the problem. And that's why I wrote here, the last point, that there is foundational hypocrisy in how Europe colonized Africa and the New World, by believing that they are bringing the light of civilization, by believing that what they are doing is they are cultivating liberty and justice, not just in Europe, but in other parts of the continent. Meanwhile, they are cultivating this civilization, or they are building this civilization, they are building this empire, right? Initially plantation-based capitalism and later on industrial capitalism, on the blood and sweat, or actually the exploitation of African American slaves, and often, sheer killing, right, and removal of indigenous population from their own land, right? So theft of land, basically. So that's why I say there is a foundational hypocrisy in how colonialism happened. Now, before I get into the crux of the matter, which is decolonization possible in a settler colonial society like Canada, let us also recognize that modern colonialism, right, is definitely premised on the fact of racism, right, on the idea of racism, or on the system of racism, right? So racism is a part and parcel of modern colonialism. Now, what is racism? Just to give you a very brief sense, sociologically speaking, racism is not a set of damaging words, such as the N word that can be hurled against African Americans, and ideals we employ to hurt, people who do not look like us or who belong to a different ethnicity or race for no reason. But racism is actually an institutionalized, systematic way of social control of one group by the other group, right? Or of groups of people by one dominant group, right? It is an institutionalized system of social control wherein those same words and ideals are consistently deployed, used for one very specific reason. And what is that reason? The systematic funneling and ensuing accumulation of wealth, power, privilege, and opportunity by one group over every other group. So I want you to keep this in mind, right, in the backdrop. Now, moving on to, the actual thing that I'm going to talk about today. And basically, I'd like to raise some questions. And what I'm really looking forward to is to hear what you have to say, or what are your thoughts on this question. And we can do a little bit of even, debating on this matter. So my plan is that for the first, say, 20-25 minutes, I would define and explain to you some keywords such as what is a settler colony, what is decolonization, how is decolonial different from decolonization, and how is post-colonial different from decolonial. Then we'll move into the meat of the matter, that is decolonization possible in a settler colonial society like Canada? So we will grapple with both arguments for and against, right? Arguments and counter arguments. We would also try to understand that in case it's not feasible, the way Canada is constituted today, if decolonization is not possible, what can we do to make things better? What can we do to free our mind of colonial mindset? And towards the end, I would keep, I have prepared some questions for our discussion and debates. But sometimes, right, as I, present I present to you the basic matter, I might also, weave in some questions, which we can again deal with it at the end, okay? So the first keyword, which is settler colony. Before I move into what is settler colony, again, just to give you a brief overview, please remember, when we say modern colonialism, what we mean is Western Christian modern colonialism, right? So there are scholars of colonialism, modern colonialism from South America, such as Mignolu and Quijano, right, who write that, and I quote them, Western colonial expansion that started with Christianity, Castile and Portugal, mainly with the conquest and colonization of the Americas, but also that expanded to Asia. When we say West, it means Western Christian to the west of the place called Jerusalem in the Middle East, right? With center in Rome, which extended its arms and laid the foundation for modern colonial globalization that also spread today's capitalist economy, capitalism. After the Portuguese came the Dutch, then came the French and the British. And later on, with the demise of the British Empire and the French Empire after the Second World War, right, in the 1940s, that was the period of the rise of American imperialism. But interestingly, unlike the old empire builders like UK, like England and France, United States did not maintain any physical colony like 18th and 19th century cases. So it did maintain colonialism, its dominance, especially in terms of economy, which also is known as imperialism, US imperialism, but without colonies. Now, if you want to know more about it, there is an excellent book, and there's also a documentary made out of this book, which is, last time when I checked, it's also available on YouTube, called The Confessions of an Economic Hitman, written by John Parkins, who used to be such an economic hitman who would go around the world to basically overpower developing poor countries in the world, especially in South America and parts of Asia, such as Philippines and Vietnam, so that American imperialism can have political and economic control over those countries. Okay, but let us also remember, when we say modern colonialism, it's quite different from ancient world's Roman Empire or Roman colonies, because unlike modern colonialism, Roman Empire was imperial, right? But it was not capitalist in nature, right? So when it comes to settler colonies, for example, let me give you this example. I said that I was born and partly raised in a post-colonial nation, that is India. So the fact that in 1947, India gained political independence from England, right, marks it becoming a post-colonial nation, right, politically independent. It's an independent nation, right? It has its own seat at the UN, right? Unlike that, settler colonies such as Canada, such as Australia, such as New Zealand, right, such as even US, they are places where colonizers are settled in. So one definition that we can use is settler colonialism is a distinct type of colonialism that functions through the replacement of indigenous populations with an invasive settler society, where European colonizers are coming in large numbers, right? And they're invading, right, and creating space for themselves, usually fertile places where it can be cultivated or where there are resources such as mines and all that. But in that process, indigenous people are being replaced. And they are sometimes pushed back to less fertile places or in other locations where the colonizers do not have much interest. And ultimately, they become reserves in the future, right? Settler colonialism is a distinct type of colonialism that functions through the replacement of indigenous population with an invasive settler society. And over time, it develops a distinctive identity and sovereignty, such as Canada. Though Canada, right, some 200, 300 years back, started becoming colonized, or in European language, in European perspective, settled, right, being civilized. Over time, Canada became an independent country. Canada has its own seat at the UN, right? And it has its own identity, our own flag, maple leaf, white and red, our own national game, hockey, right? Our national animal, beaver, and it has its own sovereignty. Another distinction of settler colonies, unlike post-colonies, is settlers, because they have moved here in large numbers, trying to replace, sometimes actually replace indigenous people by killing them, right? That has happened in large numbers in Australia, in US, but also here. sometimes in a covert manner, sometimes in an overt manner, right? I'll come to that in a few seconds. So settler colonies also try to make and remake places such as this region called Turtle Island, right? So settlers come here, they transform the land and the environment, right? By building, say, river dams, by building bridges, by building trans-Canada railways, by building, parks, by building many other things, right? Which symbolizes Canada, or sometimes it symbolizes European civilization. But in the process, it's replacing the indigenous culture, indigenous civilization, indigenous identities, not just of people, but also of that place, which used to bear all kinds of identities to do with indigenous communities and people. Settlers might also assimilate or might not assimilate with the indigenous population, right? Prime example would be the Métis population here in Canada. If you look at the history, it has been found that the Scottish and the French colonizers did readily assimilate, or sometimes, marry and intermingle and had offsprings with the indigenous population of Canada, unlike the English, right? So these are some distinctive characteristics of settler colonialism. But we also need to remember that settler colonialism is primarily based on the colonial discourse, which is the perspective which sees that the settlers are not invaders, but settlers are pioneers. They are doing something great. They are doing something heroic. So I'll just read out again a quote from a scholar of settler colonial discourse, that settlers are pioneers who are better humans, who are perceived in that colonial discourse as better humans. They are better not only from people they had left behind in Europe, because these people are more adventurous, courageous. They are coming here to settle and civilize the uncivilized parts of the world, but they are also better than the indigenous communities and peoples they would encounter. So this discourse was definitely framed in racial terms against indigenous people, as if they didn't have the light of civilization, as if they need to be improved. Indigenous people need to be improved, saved, civilized, so that they can come on the highway of progress, modernity, right? But what is also important in this settler colonial discourse, that sometimes this discourse, and by discourse what I mean, it's a sociological language or terminology. It means the dominant way of understanding something about society and culture and people, right? It's called discourse. So another important aspect of this settler colonial discourse was that oftentimes this settler colonial discourse would deny that indigenous people have actual humanity. So they were not even given the status of humanity. And that's why there is a theory from social psychologists that if you dehumanize someone, it is easier for you to perpetrate violence, torture, and different kinds of injustice and exploitation on that being, on that community, right? So you can see how the fact that when they were denied actual humanity, torture on them, exploitation on them, a genocide on them became easier for the colonizers to perpetrate and to practice, right? And what is important is these aspects of settler colonial discourse is very persistent, right? And it's quite resilient, that we encounter this discourse even today, not in an overt manner, in a direct manner, but in a much more subtle and covert way. And I'll come to that again in a few seconds. Take a look at this first stanza of a poem by Rudyard Kipling. Rudyard Kipling is an important name in English literature. He wrote the Jungle Book. Maybe you have seen that Disney picture, Jungle Book. But he was also a poet and author of short stories. But deep down, he wrote in the 19th century, he believed in the ideology of colonization of non-Europe, because he thought Europe is superior. It has to colonize the rest of the world to bring the light of civilization to the rest of the world. So here is the first stanza from one of his famous, or I would say infamous poem called White Man's Burden. written in 1899. But if you read that, if you read the lines, you can see what I mean by that. Discourse formation and framing are very important tools which were used by colonizers or colonial thinkers such as Kipling himself to consolidate the power of colonialism over non-Europeans or indigenous people, say in Canada. So very quickly, he writes, "Take up the white man's burden, send forth the best ye breed, go bind your sons to exile to serve your captives' need." Europeans have captured, right, the non-Europeans, right? And they need to save them, right? Because Europeans, the colonizers, the white man only understand, unlike the indigenous people or the colonized people who are childlike, what they need. Somebody who is superior, like your parents, they understand what a kid needs, right? So it's that kind of approach, it's that kind of attitude, or to put it in a more sociological language, it's that kind of framing that helps to consolidate power. To wait in heavy harness on fluttered folk and wild, and this is very significant, the last two lines, your new caught sullen peoples, half devil and half child, right? So colonized people are described as, identified here as half devil, right? And devil here means, of course, uncivilized, and half child, people who are not mature, right? Not adults, do not have that thinking power to make decisions, okay? Now, if we move into our own country in Canada, a settler colonial country, in Canada as elsewhere, settler colonizers, of course, tried in part to dispossess indigenous people of their traditional territories, right? Of their lands, right? Stealing of lands through sometimes slow, but sometimes fast forms of violence, okay? And to remake these lands in the image of those they had left behind. I mean, the very fact that I am sitting in a city called London, and the river which runs through this city in Ontario is named the Thames, right? Which is a great example of that, how the colonizers tried to remake these region and land, right? Or say Turtle Island, right? In the image of those that they left behind, right? So they were carrying that nostalgia, but in doing that, they erased the identity of indigenous markings, indigenous identities, right? There is also another important point raised by two important indigenous scholars from Canada, such as Hayden King and Shuri Pasternak, who say that the theft of indigenous lands and waters that happen in Canada and their development by Canadian governments and corporations, right? Such as, say, the Hudson Bay, such as, say, the hydro companies in different provinces of Canada, BC, Ontario, and so on. They are all foundational components of Canada's political economic landscape in the past and the present. So you can see how from a settler colony, when Canada becomes industrialized, with the construction of bridges, railways, industries, hydropower dams, and all that, it gives rise to a sovereign nation called Canada. But deep down, basically, it's a settler colonial nation or a settler colony. Of course, even 10 years back, this identity of Canada as a settler colony was not being discussed so openly, which we can do today, right? Say post the publication of TRC document, right? Truth and Reconciliation document, right? So this buzz about Canada is not actually just a nation, but Canada is a settler colonial society, settler colonial nation, and we have things to grapple with, is something very recent, right? One of the three important arms of settler colonialism in Canada is the institution of law. And one prime example of that is the Indian Act of 1876, which is basically a racist act, which tries to demarcate indigenous population, right, with categories such as First Nations, Inuit and Métis, etc., and so on, by almost fossilizing them as something very exotic and distinct. Of course, if you read, for example, point number 3 here, it says that Indigenous festival of potlatch cannot be celebrated. So there were all those kinds of banning. But if you read the Indian Act, the very premise of it is not only racist, but the very premise of it makes it possible to see the indigenous people of Canada as something so different that they have to be settled on reserves, that they cannot be integrated with the rest of Canada, which at that point of time was, of course, Euro-Canada, right? European Canadians, right? The other two important arms were RCMP, the police and the army, and the Christian missionary, right? Who you know founded the infamous residential school system in Canada, right? So the missionary, the police, army, RCMP, and the legal institutions. And sometimes, because Canada was, in 19th century, quite a wilderness, right? A wild region, right? Full of jungles and forests and all that. So often forest wardens were also important players in this consolidation of colonial power and settler colonialism, right? How they drove out indigenous population, right? Out of fertile land or out of lands which had resources like minerals and all that. So what is important, and I'm not going to read the whole quote to save time, right? Because I also have to think about time management. But read the headline, which I have written here, that for the purpose of settling Canada, indigenous people of Canada became unsettled, right? And what is important is these different phases of settler colonization or settler colonialism that happened in this landmass called Canada or Turtle Island. So read this second point, which I have taken from the works of Piper and Sandlows. Scholars have dated the rise and consolidation of settler colonial forms of occupation and rule to roughly the late 18th century in the eastern parts of Canada, today's Atlantic Canada, initially, places like New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, followed by the late 19th century in its western portions, that is BC, right, Alberta, and roughly the late 20th century in the Arctic North, right? Though this is a little debatable. But what is important for us to remember is this settling, right? Initially Eastern, Atlantic, Ontario, then West, and then, prairies and all that, which were very fertile, right? In terms of cultivation, agricultural production, were all on the basis of extracting profit out of agriculture, out of mineral resources, right? So historians of Canada have found today that territories which were fertile for agriculture, territories which had rich mineral resources were deliberately colonized and captured and settled, right? Much more quickly, right, by the colonizers than other parts of than other regions of this landmass called Canada, right? So the principle was basically extractivism, extracting profit, extracting minerals, extracting resources, right? And the motive was definitely commercial and imperial, right? But what we also have to remember that the settling of Canada to unsettle the natives also has the aspect of unsettling the ecology of Canada, right? Due to this extraction of mineral resources, this extraction of fertile land, and later on, of course, rapid industrialization, right, of its rivers, of its land, and so on. When it comes to settler colonialism, it's not only theft of land, extracting profit out of fertile land, mines and mineral resources, or from its rivers, such as fishing or animals, right, like bisons and all that. But settler colonialism is also built on brainwashing the mind by making colonized people, indigenous people, think that they lack something, that they are inferior, and they need to shed, they need to get rid of their indigenous identities, be it that of language, religion, food, how they eat, dress, or different ceremonies, right? So that saying, the infamous saying from MacDonald or his team, that residential schools' purpose is to kill the Indianness, or I can replace the Indian by using the correct word, indigenous, right? Because that's a misnomer, Columbus understood, Columbus by mistake thought, when he discovered, quote unquote, discovered North America, he thought that he has reached India, where I was born, right? So that's a misnomer. So what settler colonizers wanted through the residential school system is that they want to kill the indigenous identity, but save the man. So that this hollow man who has been, whose indigenous identity, language, etc., has been sucked out, can now be filled in with Christianity, with English or French, with eating with fork and knife, or wearing trousers and so on, or celebrating Christmas. Right? So residential schools were based on a system designed, purposefully designed, to alienate indigenous students from their culture. So that can create a lot of hollowness, that can create a lot of anxiety, uncertainty, lack of confidence, and ultimately, death, dying, right? There are several cases, and there are scores of documentaries and written records which are being discovered. You can find online today, right? CBC has done excellent work, right? Making documentaries on the residential school system and what happened in them. So if you look at it, especially with critical sociological eyes, what we see is, again, a system of framing, where this colonial narrative is trying to uphold white supremacy and racial hierarchy. Remember, I said that one important premise of colonization and settler colonialism is racism and white supremacy, right? Today, at least even 10 years back, even 20 years back, even scholars, even sociologists, when I was finishing my PhD degree at UBC, scholars, even sociologists, Department of Sociology or Anthropology, used to say that what happened in Canada is not genocide, such as, Nazi Germany, but what happened here is cultural genocide. But today, with new evidence of unmarked graveyard, today with new evidence that at residential schools, purposefully unhygienic conditions were kept alive, right? Which gave rise to, tuberculosis and, rapid dying of these children. Even when there were some conscientious doctors who wrote to the school authorities that, do something about how this place is set up and organized there, how their beds are, or how they are eating, or whatever, right? People didn't pay attention, right? The authorities. So that's, purposeful negligence, and that is not just cultural genocide. That is, and I also absolutely would defend this position. What happened in residential schools is not just forgetting of the language and cultural genocide, but actual genocide, given the new evidence, okay? Now, if you're more interested, actually, Manisha would later on take these slides, and she would post this on your library system or the archive that you have. For additional learning activity, here is a particular online thing that just came out, online report that came out, I think, just 2 days back on CBC's online website web page. It talks about the suicide of a student named Richard Thomas in a residential school in BC. But if you look at the actually what happened, it's a question whether he committed suicide or it was actually a killing, right? So I can't get into the details, but you can see what I was trying to say, that it's not just cultural genocide, but actual genocide. And through the life and story of Richard Thomas and his death, you can gain that additional learning about why I say it's genocide and not just cultural genocide. What is happening today when we try to understand, colonialism built on the premise of racism, that the old school overt racism is gone, and it has been replaced by much subtle forms of racism and discrimination. One example of that is white benevolence, and there is a book out by that name, which is coming out this year. White benevolence, and I would first describe it, and you try to see whether you can find that around you in terms of what government officials say, in terms of what you find in mainstream media, in terms of what you have found so far in your education system, in the public school system, in your history textbooks, in your history learning, in your school curriculum, or even in your college and university curriculum. White benevolence is a form of paternalistic racism that reinforces racial hierarchies and can be found across Canadian institutions such as education, public health, social work, and criminal justice. When working with Indigenous people, the helping professions such as teachers, social workers, healthcare workers, or say criminal justice lawyers or criminal justice administrators, they often reinforce the colonial lie that Indigenous people need saving. White settlers working in these institutions, they shape, defend, and uphold institutional racism, even when they are saying, they are verbalizing, they are professing that they want to support Indigenous people. Therefore, white supremacy shows up in the everyday behaviors, language, and assumptions of white professionals who reproduce myths that Indigenous people are inferior by nature, as if biological, right? As if given. They lack something, there is a deficit. And the white settlers today, in the form of these white professionals working in these institutions of education, public health, social work, and criminal justice, they can help them get out of the mess. They can help them get out of the problem. But in this understanding, there is lack of this very important recognition that the fact that they are in some kind of mess, it can be drug addiction, it can be alcoholism, it can be deep-ridden poverty, it can be other forms of abuses within the community. The fact that this mess has been created due to settler colonialism, the fact that this mess has been created, right, that the fact that they are ridden with all these kind of socioeconomic problems is due to the fact that they have been colonized. Certain things have been, they have been wronged, right? And they didn't get fair share of the justice, right? Even though Canada boasts itself as a modern nation, right? Fighting for justice, fighting for equality, fighting for fairness at international platforms such as United Nations. My question to you, since you have, I hope you have understood what I mean by white benevolence, a more covert way of practicing colonial racism today. Do you think, and here is just a question, do you think our Canadian governments, Canadian federal governments, Truth and Reconciliation Commission, right? Truth and TRC Commission of Canada and the calls to action, is this an example of white benevolence by the state of Canada? Though it talks about calls to action, but the action is really missing, right? And there are scores of examples that it's missing, right? So I would raise this question. Is the TRC and the Canadian states' calls to action, is it an example of white benevolence, right? Okay. Moving on to the second keyword. I know I'm running a little, Manisha, is it okay if I go a little over 2?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. And I hope our audience members can also stay on, but I'll move fast. The second keyword that I want to explain here which can help us to grapple with this question: is decolonization possible in a settler colonial society like Canada is? Decolonization is different from post-colonial. India, or say Kenya, or say Uganda. Kenya, Uganda are countries in Africa. They are examples of post-colonial nations. That is, they gained independence in middle 20th century, 1940s, 1950s. Though they gained political independence, but given the nature of the global divide, where rich countries, developed countries often arm twist developing, least developed and poor countries when it comes to trade agreements, when it comes to who has more power, when it comes to declaring war and doing business at United Nations in Geneva and so on. Of course, we still see that these developing countries, these post-independent countries, still suffer from the post-colonial conditions. These post-colonial nations have this unique condition, and that made scholars from these countries develop a new field of study called post-colonial studies, where what they do is they critically analyze colonial discourse, not only from 18th, 19th century, but also from 20th century. For example, when America is invading Iraq, right, in 1990s, Gulf War, not all developing countries supported America. So what was the colonial discourse? How America was trying to arm twist poorer countries so that they can join America by supplying force, sometimes soldiers, or sometimes other kinds of resources, so that America can win the war against Iraq, by framing it as if this is a global war. It's not just America against Iraq, but it's a global war, because terrorism is global, and as if terrorists from Iraq are going to attack rest of the world. So again, a matter of framing, how things are being framed, and how, due to this framing, all kinds of players are being forced into this war, right? In contrast to post-colonial thoughts and conditions, decolonial thoughts mean something different. But before I explain to you what is decolonial thought, I need to tell you that decolonization is not the same as decoloniality. 1947, India became decolonized. It gained political independence. It became a sovereign country. No more a colony of British Empire, British Raj, right? But what we find often in these post-colonial countries, such as India, Kenya, or say Pakistan, or say Vietnam, that though the European colonizers have left, but the native elites of those countries are now exploiting the commoners of those countries. So the native elites had replaced the colonizers, and they have attained and they control the privilege and the different kinds of institutions, right? So one prime example would be, very quickly, that the Indian National Congress was an important party which helped to fight the English rule and to gain independence of India. But what has been found today through scholarship and research, that the downtrodden of India, right, people who belong to the lower class and lowest caste of India, right, another form of social discrimination in India, they were not helped by this elite party and its elite leaders, right? So that is another problem of decolonized post-colonial countries. Though they are decolonized, but not everything happening in them is hunky-dory, right? In contrast to decolonization, decoloniality means getting rid of colonial mindset, getting rid of the sense of inferiority, to put it in simple words. So I'll just go by the more scholastic definition. What decoloniality tries to understand is the close-knit relationship between colonial condition, right, and the imposition of a Western or European logic of modernity as a consequence of colonialism. I mean, just think about the poem by Kipling called White Man's Burden, right? That there was absolute darkness, that there was absolute uncivilized condition in Canada, and the European colonizers are bringing in the light of civilization here, right? And they are saving the indigenous people of Canada, right? So decoloniality is not so much a political project such as, decolonization and independence of, say, India or Canada, right? But rather, and this is important for us to remember, or for you to understand, that decoloniality is actually a matter of knowledge. It's an epistemological method, that is a different way of thinking to de-link ourselves who are colonized from the structure of knowledge imposed by colonizers. That you are lacking something, there is something deficit in you, your language is not good enough, you have to unlearn your language and learn French and English. And then to reconstitute our ways of thinking, speaking, and living, right? So the fact today in Canada, there is this movement about gaining back Anishinaabe language, Cree language, right? Mohawk language, and so on, can be seen as a method of decoloniality, right? We are trying to reconstitute our ways of thinking, speaking, and living. Today, the fact that we can openly practice, say, potlatch, right? Or some other forms of ceremony, right? Can also be seen as a method of decoloniality. Today, if we think that not everything that Europe gave us in terms of modern science is beneficial. When it comes to allopathic medicine, such as antibiotics, it also has its dangerous impact, which is side effects. If we gain that knowledge, if we gain that thinking, that would also be a kind of decoloniality. But I want you to think that there are two aspects here. Decolonization of Canada. To me, that seems impossible, but I want to know your response. That is, like Kenya or Uganda or India or Pakistan, Canada or indigenous people of Canada can get rid of its colonizers. That is, its settled European Canadians. That seems impossible, right? But then there is another method which I think can be practiced, which is being decolonial in Canada. Being decolonial in Canada in terms of thinking, living, and speaking, and how to go about that, how to do that. So my question to you is, what would it take to decolonize our institutions and ourselves in the current context of Canada? Is complete political decolonization possible? To me, it seems not possible. But can we make our school curriculum, our university curriculum, the way our healthcare system works, public healthcare system works, can we make them decolonial in contemporary Canada, right? So I want you to think about these two aspects: decolonization of Canada and being decolonial in Canada. What is more feasible? What is not so feasible? Now, already United Nations, way back in 2007, right now we are speaking in it's 2022, way back in 2007, United Nations had declared a particular law, a particular act, which goes by the name of International Protection of the Rights of Indigenous People, which gives, which is an umbrella law and organization that will protect Indigenous people, not only in Canada, but also in India, in Australia, New Zealand, or in Bolivia and Chile. But I want you also to remember that initially, when on 13th of September 2007, 144 states voted in favor of giving or passing this rights of Indigenous people known as UNDRIP, UNDRIP. There were 4 votes, all 4 from settler colonies such as Australia, our Canada, New Zealand, and United States, who did not vote in favor of UNDRIP. That's telling, right? That's telling. And you can see how the whole dialogue, debate, and discussion of settler colonialism has changed from 2007 to 2022 today, right? But of course, let me also bring this point that much later, even these 4 countries actually also adopted UNDRIP, okay? But step towards decolonization is not only that international recognition that can come from UN, right, which is kind of the umbrella international body, but if we really have to improve the conditions which can make possible decolonization, we also have to think in terms of improving relationship between settlers and indigenous in settler colonies, right? How to go about that, how to do that. Because we all know, not just overt racism, but today in our different institutions, education, public health care, so on and so forth, what we find today is white benevolence, right? More subtle and covert form of racism. So the big questions remain that how to be good relatives in today's Canada, which is a settler colonial society. There's no denial of it. And I raised this point that unlike a country like India, unlike a country like Kenya in Africa, it is really not feasible to eject out the European origin people of Canada, or to eject out, replace, displace today, even say Chinese Canadians, Indian Canadians, or say South American Canadians, right? That seems not feasible, not just from a humanitarian ground, but also from the fact of politics, economics, so on and so forth, because all these groups make some kind of contributions today, right? So if we are thinking of Canada, of course, a settler society, settler colony, but today it's constituted by diverse people of diverse linguistic background, ethnic background, so on and so forth. How to be good relatives who shared this land called Turtle Island or Canada. Second question is, how to know the truth of Canada? How to know the truth of Canada as a settler society, settler colony? And after knowing the truth that Canada, the sovereign country, was founded on the basis of settler colonialism, and there are foundational violence, there are foundational hypocrisy in how Canada has been settled, how to reconcile with it? And following that, what kind of actions can we take, right? So these are some big questions. But remember that nothing will change if we don't act or speak up. The fact that Manisha and her team had invited me, right, to talk about this topic and to have a discussion with you is an act of that courage, is an act of, speaking up. But not only speaking up, we also need to reflect and learn. The fact that today Ryerson University has been renamed as Toronto Metropolitan University, for the last few years, at least since last 3-4 years, there has been a global movement to remove statues of important figures who had directly or sometimes indirectly participated in Atlantic slavery, colonialism, colonial exploitation, right? One big name being Cecil Rhodes, whose statue used to stand on the campus of Oxford University in England, or whose statue could be found in different campuses in South Africa. But he was, there are countless examples how he practiced violent forms of colonialism, right? And take a look at the lines which are bolded. initially, when all these debates were raging, apologists said that if you remove these kind of statues of, say, McDonald's or Cecil Rhodes, you are actually removing history. I mean, if you keep them, actually, we would also remember that such histories happened, colonial histories had happened. But the counter argument which was given is an example of reflection, critical reflection. Take a look. While voices opposing the removal argue that figures like Rhodes or our John MacDonald had made substantial contribution to, say, England or Canada, and that removing statues means hiding history. This college in Oxford, Oriel College, said that the proposal was the result of a thoughtful period of debate and reflection, demonstrating that the university and college's 21st century commitment to diversity. So far from hiding history by removing these statues or renaming Ryerson University as Toronto Metropolitan University, what is being done is we are remembering and acknowledging our intellectual understanding, which is evolved and improved from flawed or wrong perceptions of racial hierarchy, superiority of previous centuries, right? So this is an act of reflection. So I said, remember that nothing will change if we don't act or speak up. Nothing will change if we don't reflect and learn, right? So this is an example of reflection, and here is an example of learning. When the pandemic happened, right, 2020, initially, of course, the great figure, of course, in a sarcastic way, Donald Trump said it's a Chinese virus. It was not a Chinese virus, but it was a kind of coronavirus. A different variant of this coronavirus had also already happened in places like Hong Kong and China and Southeast Asia in 2003 and 4, which was called SARS. The fact that these Southeast Asian countries had experience of dealing with this kind of coronavirus, and that's why they used to wear masks, even back then, was ridiculed by Western governments and Western medical experts out of a sense of superiority. And of course, you know what happened to many Asian-looking and Chinese people, right, in North America, whether in Vancouver and other parts of America, right? They were, they were assaulted, right? As if the coronavirus has been caused by these people, Chinese-looking people or Chinese people, right? So the fact that even today, Western governments, Western medical experts, out of their superiority complex, denied that and ridiculed that they can learn something from East Asian regions, because these East Asian countries had dealt with the SARS coronavirus epidemic way back in 2003, is an example of that colonial powers, colonial nations, right, settler colonial power elites need to unlearn what they believe in, that is their superiority, right? So remember I asked you that is TRC and the calls to action from the federal government of Canada, Canadian state, is it an example of white benevolence? Already, many Indigenous scholars, many Indigenous activists, right? If you look at their podcasts, right, what they write on different online social platforms, social media platforms, they are saying, unless there's truth, how can there be a meaningful reconciliation? Unless our history curriculum remains unchanged, right? Where the very acknowledgement of Canada as a settler colony is never acknowledged, is never taught, is never understood, is never analyzed. How can we move forward for a meaningful reconciliation, right? So in this context, the fact that I've tried to explain to you by now what is settler colonialism. I tried to explain to you that decolonization is different from having a decolonial mentality and decolonial thought. I told you that today what we have around us is a more subtle form of racism or colonial racism called white benevolence, and which often can be found in different sectors or institutions of Canada, such as education, public health, criminal justice system, and so on. So my question to you is, with this critical point, if there's no truth, how can there be a meaningful reconciliation? What do you think of canceling Canada Day? I believe you know, for the last few years, there is a debate raging across Canada. Should we celebrate July 1 as Canada Day? What do we celebrate on July 1? What is Canada Day? Why do we celebrate it? And when we celebrate July 1 as Canada Day, basically it was settling of Canada, but by way of settling Canada, Indigenous communities, cultures, and even actually their whole identities, right, were unsettled, right? So what does celebration of Canada Day signify, especially if we are thinking in terms of the bigger goals of decolonization and decoloniality? So I have a few more things to before I conclude, but I would like to raise this question to you. I see there are many chat messages, and of course I cannot go through them all at once, so I'll take some time. And Manisha, can I kindly request you, because if you when you end the session, these chat messages might disappear. I would like to have these chat messages. Manisha?
Yes, yes. I can email them to you, and all of the attendees in this microlearning session, you can also download the chat. All of you can download the chat if you like. Okay. In chat, there are 3 dots. If you click on the 3 dots, the first thing says save chat.
Save chat.
Yes.
Okay.
So all of us can save chat. I will also save the chat and I will send it to all of you.
Okay, okay. I think something is happening because I clicked on save chat, but let me cross this right now. So I see there are 30 participants. Can somebody, because I cannot see you, I'll try to see somebody's faces. I don't know whether it's visible. I see Manisha's face now. Let me make, okay, and some people. Can somebody tell me, what is your response about this question? In the context of, if there is no truth, how can there be a meaningful reconciliation? Should we celebrate July 1 as Canada Day? What is Canada Day? What do we celebrate? Do we need to celebrate? Or should we discontinue? Anyone?
Tamara Hawken is saying, I'd love to see an evolution of July 1st to celebrate and be thankful for this beautiful land, moving away from celebrating colonialism and the Canadian flag.
So that Tamara has written, right? Did you say?
Yes.
Did you read out from Tamara? Oh, just one second. Okay. I'm so sorry. I'm a little not so good with, okay.
Go ahead, Penina. You can unmute and...
yes, please unmute and speak. We are having an open discussion here.
Hello, I'm not sure if you can see me. I don't see myself here, but when I look at your question here, the statement, if there's no truth, how can there be a meaningful reconciliation? But from my perspective as an Indigenous person in Canada, a survivor, an intergenerational survivor of the Canadian Indian residential school system, I'm MMIWG survivor, I want to know how much more of my trauma needs to be farmed before people will start reconciling those experiences and accept them as reality and move forward from here, because this is the frustration of so many Indigenous people across this country. Why do we keep sharing our stories and our experiences and reliving our traumas?
Yeah.
And sharing our truth if no one's actually going to follow through and just pick one of the TRC calls to action,
yeah,
and work on it?
Yeah. So the action is missing, right?
Yes.
Yes. So again, I believe if I'm not, I'm hoping I'm not mispronouncing your name, Penina, that it seems you agree with me, TRC is a sham, and it's an example of that kind of white benevolence, where the whole cottage industry of academic scholarship, who are all gung-ho about, doing publishing on decolonization, right? There are courses titled decolonization, when we all know decolonization actually is not feasible, right? What we understand by decolonization, that these people, right, the professionals in these sectors of education, health, and all that, they are making profit by sometimes, padding up their CVs, right? Or getting funding and grants and so on, right? So it's so I believe what I was arguing earlier, Penina might agree with me that it's an example of white benevolence today. Okay, I see another thing from Keith King. Am I right? I sadly have to jump out, but I want to thank you. Okay, sure. Thank you, Keith. No problem. Jenny says, I want them to stop diminishing the experience and acknowledge them as real. Diminishing the experience, acknowledge them as real, especially saying it wasn't that bad. Yes. So may I know, Jenny, who says it wasn't that bad? Apologists of colonialism, who says it? Is it? Yes.
I had an uncle who taught at a boarding school, and he did it because he felt it was his Christian duty to bring Christ to these people, and saying that it was a positive experience when in fact I know it couldn't have been. They threatened me with boarding school too, but for bad behavior, of course. But saying it's not that bad, it's also the equivalent of you hear it with rape and other aggressions like that. Well, it isn't that bad. It's the people in power saying it isn't that bad. Oh, yes, it was. You just have never been subjected to it. Doesn't mean it wasn't bad.
Yes. Absolutely. I agree with you, Jenny. And the fact that today there is more emphasis on lived experience, right? People who lived such horrible experiences. And of course, I know that's traumatic, as Penina was saying, right? How many times we have to recount our, abused past and, traumas before something is done. But the fact today that, and this is a glimmer of hope, that today victims are believed, right? Whether it's sexual assault or victims of residential school, right? Where there is a re-emphasis on the fact that we should pay extra attention to people who have lived experiences. I think these are important steps. These are important steps which can help us to, go on fighting for this cause of decoloniality, right? Okay. I see another message, new re-traumatizing. Yes, re-traumatizing. Very good. Yes, I agree. It's a form of re-traumatizing. Okay, moving on. Sorry, yes.
Dr. Datta, at the Maskwacis Cultural College, we have oral history recordings from 1974 onwards. And what I hear from the elders and people who shared their residential school experience, it is re-traumatizing and it is very hard on them. And I hear at the power also, which we had of elders who went to residential school when the when the graves of the children were discovered, it all came alive. Like the trauma really came alive. By just having helplines is not the solution.
No, not the solution. And this is the point, right? Initially, these people were indigenous people or colonized people were dehumanized, right? Now, when there is an approach, at least theoretically speaking, at the policy level, right, that justice should be given out, meted out, and all that. Again, the fact that they have to undergo re-traumatization is denial, is an example of denial of their humanity, right? Right? If you treat somebody as equal to you, somebody who is pained, who gets hurt, and so on, you'd really care about not to re-traumatize them, right? When we all know calls to action is just on those papers, right? Nothing has actually happened, right? Right? So yes, I agree with you. I just want to, two questions were sent to me, and I hope I'll be able to wrap up in 10-15 minutes. And thank you for being patient and giving me this extra time. One question was the fact that today there is all these, buzz about indigenous ways of knowing, indigenous ways of literacy. Are these for real, or are these real, or are they going to give us decolonization, or is it a new form of colonizing practice, right? So I would say indeed, it would be another form of recolonization unless actually there's real power sharing, right? For every economic and political decision making that should involve indigenous communities at every level. Unless it's done, power sharing, these kind of things, which is, indigenous ways of knowing, indigenous ways of literacy, language revival, these are not really going to solve the problem deep down, which are structural problems, which are problems of poverty, which are problems of infrastructure, which are problems of socioeconomy, right? Secondly, unless we get rid of the racist Indian Act, right, which because this law racializes indigenous people and disempowers them. Thirdly, I also think that oftentimes, not only the 19th century Indian Act, but the fact that TRC often think of indigenous community in Canada only in terms of culture, as if they do not need the politics and economic power, political and economic power. If they can gain back their cultural power, their language, their form of dressing, their food, as if that is going to give them all kinds of empowerment. I think that's a limited way, and I would say it's a dangerous and colonial way of thinking. We should not fossilize indigenous communities just as cultures. They also need economic power, political power, and that's why power sharing. Whether you're going to build a highway across the province, or you're going to do some mining in near reserves, decision making should be shared. Power sharing should be there. Also, I think, and this is important, I give the example of India. Ancient India had this form of physical and mental exercise called yoga. I believe most people know about yoga, right? Meditation and doing some kind of physical exercise, right? Yogasana, yoga. And an ancient form of medicine, which is Ayurveda. But I'll just focus on yoga. Think about it today. Yoga has become global. Many Indians feel proud of the fact that we gave yoga to the world. Of course, it has its bad side, that is, yoga has become very commercialized, right? Initially, in ancient India, yoga cannot be sold. Yoga cannot be taught by exchange of money. But because we live in a capitalist system, right? Yoga centers are, built on the premise of profit and all that. But I give this example because I think a sure way of decoloniality of indigenous people of India, indigenous people of Canada, a sure way of developing decoloniality among Canadians, among indigenous Canadians, or even settler Canadians like me, would be to try to dig out important knowledge resources from indigenous communities, cultures, and epistemology, knowledge system, which can solve problems of the world. then the fact that they were constantly inferiorized, then the fact that they were constantly placed lower in the rank of, racial hierarchy, the fact that settler colonizers thought they had nothing, they lack everything, so we have to give them everything. There is nothing that we can take from them, learn from them, and use it, right, to build countries, to build regions, to develop and all that. That fact needs to be reversed. And for that, we need digging, exploring, examining, and culling out, bringing out important knowledge resources from indigenous knowledge system. I believe you got my point, right? And the other thing is, and this one, I think decolonization needs to happen at 3 levels. Whether it's feasible right now at the current moment, I am doubtful, but decolonization has to happen at 3 levels. One is at this level of social, history writing, how history has been written. What is colonial identity? Is there a need for a Canada Day? What do we mean by Canadian culture? What is this? What is the value of the Canadian flag, right? Second is at the level of psychology. We have to decolonize our mind so that whether they are settlers or even indigenous people, because sometimes racism is also internalized by people who are racialized. African Americans can internalize racism and they think lowly of themselves, right? So at the psychological level, decolonization has to happen to fight bias, privilege, internalized colonialism, and sense of inferiority. And thirdly, at the level of external forces, external relationships, decolonization has to happen between interpersonal relationship, right, between settlers and indigenous people. At the level of institutions, so that institutions are not merely practicing white benevolence. And also at the level of structure, when I said there has to be real power sharing, every decision making at every level should involve indigenous people, right? Indigenous representation. I will end with a particular quote from one important post-colonial poet and intellectual or thinker from India who lived in late 19th and early 20th century, whose name was Rabindranath Tagore. In fact, he won Nobel Prize for Literature, and he was the first Asian who won that prize. In one of his writings, he had written this, and please take a note. And I want you to think whether what he's saying here has some relevance for our country, Canada, especially if we want to practice decoloniality. He said, just one second, I cannot see the whole thing. He said that I do not believe in the superiority of material civilization of Europe. He was writing this, of course, when India was still a British colony. But he said that we live in a time, which is mid-20th century, when for the coordination of the cultures of the world, where each culture will give and take from the other and not shut each other out, which happened in colonialism, which happened in settler colonization, whether of Canada, of India, right? As if indigenous communities have nothing useful, have nothing important that can be learned by Europeans or Indians or Chinese and whatever. What is also important, this person, Rabindranath Tagore, later on founded a university in eastern part of India called Vishwabharati University. And he said that the principle on which this university should run is this. It should be a center of education and learning where our, meaning colonized people, or we can say indigenous people, where indigenous people's gaze will no longer be timid and dazed when turned towards the West, the colonizers, the Europeans. But our heads will be erect and safe from insult. Do you get the point? I believe you get the point. Am I right? He says that we stand at a moment when, for the development and progress of the world, scientific development, literature development, cultural development, knowledge development, medicinal development, each culture has to learn from each other. There are good and bad in every culture. Why don't we take this approach that I give you what is good in me, you take what is good in me, I reject what is bad in me, and you also reject what is bad in you, in your culture. In you means in your culture. But when we do this exchange between cultures globally, the indigenous people who were colonized by the Europeans should not have their gaze timid and dazed, should not suffer from a sense of inferiority, but today they should stand with their head upright, right, with pride about their cultural resources, values, right? So if you, with this in mind, I want to raise this question, and this is my last point. In Canada, can we become decolonial by adopting this approach? Because I said, at least I think, decolonization, complete decolonization, right? Ejecting out people who were ex-colonizers is not feasible today. In fact, even indigenous people of Canada say we have to, forgive and try to build a positive relationship where indigenous people are not exploited. There is fairness, there is justice, but also we need to come together, to celebrate this country, and move forward. So my question to you is, in today's Canada, can we become decolonial in thinking, in practice, in living, by adopting the following approach, where each community or cultural community will give and take from the other and not shut each other out? But as I said, even today's white benevolence does try to shut each other out sometimes, where our gaze will no longer be timid and dazed, but turn towards the West. When turned towards the West, Europeans, and our heads will be erect and safe from insult. But also I add, this decolonial, we can become decolonial in contemporary Canada, not just indigenous people, but all kinds of settlers. When the gaze on the other side, that is on the side of European Canadians and colonizers, ex-colonizers, should also get rid of its sense of superiority and paternalism. Unless you get rid of your superiority, unless you recognize that you can also learn from indigenous groups, you can also unlearn the bad elements of your culture, we cannot become decolonial in contemporary Canada, right? And what has also been discussed, it has been written about, it has been well researched, there are books out of it. The colonizers, the Europeans, the West should also acknowledge how the West constantly over centuries have borrowed ideas from the non-West, but they often purposefully suppressed this fact to put up the facade of superiority and, Europeans or the whites being the master race, right? So I would end here by making this point. Can we become decolonial in contemporary Canada by adopting this approach? And I would like to hear a few points. I know I am almost 30 minutes beyond my time, but I hope this is all for the purpose of better understanding. Yes, CP, Claudia says, yes, recording would be shared. Okay, Jadine. Difficult to trust and ask. Land was chairs, trust and pipe was the evidence of treaty signing. Yes. Yes, okay. Land, language was already stolen. Yes, identity. And the sense of pride and superiority, right? A sense of pride and confidence. Of course, But still, indigenous people are resilient enough that they are still fighting. I think that is also important. Jenny MA says, thank you. Okay. What do you think? Anybody? Of course, not myself and Manisha, but people who are still here, around 18, I think, excluding me and Manisha. What do you think? Can we become decolonial? I hope I could make you understand the difference between becoming decolonial and decolonization. Decolonization at this moment is not feasible, it seems. But decoloniality in thinking, in living, in practicing. Can this be done? Through these approaches, maybe you have some other ideas. You might come up with other approaches. Anybody? No pressure though, I understand. It has been long, almost one hour, 30 minutes.
I want to say for academic institutions, whether it is a larger university you work with or a small college, Maskwacis Cultural College on the Reserve, I think we also have to become decolonial ourselves, because our courses are transferable. So we have the same institutional colonized structure for transferring credits and the courses. We are becoming decolonial over here. At the college, for our president, she removed her the signage outside her board, which had, president. She removed that and she's put only her Cree name in Cree syllabics. And I think that's fantastic because it is showing it's not taking hierarchy into consideration, and it's putting modeling and actually practicing and doing the language by using her indigenous name, which is Kihu Isqueo in syllabics. So if you don't know syllabics, you can't read it. That means you have to learn the language. And it is privileging and using, using our Cree language syllabics first approach, not just talking about it, but actually doing it. Yeah. Doing the language, using the language.
Using the language, using the language. Yeah, very good point, right? I have also read some indigenous feminist authors from the US especially, and also from Canada, who say that some of the important gender revolutions were already there in indigenous communities, right? In some communities, not all. And how white feminism adopted it, but not always acknowledged it. Remember this last point. Acknowledge that the West has also borrowed ideas from the non-West or the indigenous communities, right? And there are countless examples of this hypocrisy, not just within Canada, but in the rest of the world, right? Whether you're borrowed from China or India and so on, or, algebra came from the Arabs, right? Which is kind of the backbone of many important scientific mathematical models and all that. Okay. But can I again ask, because, to be frank, that see, thank you, Tamarack. Okay. I want to save all this because I cannot read so quickly. I told you I'm Generation X. I'm not so adept. I'm not so expert in, talking and reading the text and texting back. So I need to save. Manisha, I believe you can help me, right? I do not want to miss all these comments, because to me, that's part of my learning. The fact that I presented is also, is actually an effort towards learning. So can I again ask, do you here, whether you're students or you're practitioners or professionals, I do not know, right? Each and everybody's background, but can you think of a method which we can adopt in Canada to practice decoloniality, to bring in decolonial living, thinking in our everyday life? Of course, language, right? Co-opt and claim ideas of others. Yes, Jenny, you are right, absolutely. And it's a sign of domination, right? Right? Domination, framing, domination, framing, right? A sense of superiority. I said it before anybody. But if you dig deeper, you see that what is being said actually has borrowed different ingredients from elsewhere. And sometimes the same thing actually existed in a different form elsewhere, right? There are countless examples of this. Yes, erasing others to claim power. Yes. Erasing others to claim power. Yes. But I mean, these are all problems that we are talking about, right? But, by nature, I am an optimist and I want to see the glass as half full. So my question to you, I mean, I tried to explain to you some of the keywords. I tried to explain to you, practically speaking, why I think decolonization is not feasible at this moment, but there is possibility of bringing in decolonial living and practicing, thinking. Okay. So Manisha says, okay, to practice the TRC. Asako, I don't know about, we could push more of curricular thinking in every aspect of our society. Yeah. Yeah. Climate change, the ecological disaster has deep connection with the growth of capitalism and, colonizing, right? The flora and fauna of the world, right? Again, it's a big matter and I cannot get into it today. But again, I ask this question, do you have any idea what sure short steps could we adopt to bring in decoloniality in everyday living of Canadians? Anybody? As a person who is immersed in, the sector of education, I think a sure short way would be revolutionizing the school curriculum. I think that is one of the most important things, especially for the next generation, not just for Indigenous population, but also settler population, migrant population, for everyone, right? At least I think if the education system can be revolutionized, that is one way of bringing in decolonial thinking and living. Okay. So may I know very quickly, people who are here, most of you, are you students? I mean, you can just click that icon. If you are not, maybe you can say that I'm a journalist or I'm a whatever. Are most people students at the college or elsewhere? I'm a librarian, YTC student, okay. Communications professional, okay. So Nina, are you a journalist? No, I see, okay. Communication professional, okay. So it's a good mix, okay. So, former student always trying to learn. Yes, absolutely, Dawn. I have the same idea. I also believe in that. So, without any more delay, and thank you again. Can I, Manisha, can I stop share so that I can see people's faces and all that now?
Yes, you can stop sharing the screen.
Okay, good. Okay, thank you all these 13 participants, right, who are so patient and kind, right? The fact that I went a little over time, but I knew that Manisha told me it's lunchtime, so I can do that. As I was organizing my slides, I wanted to make it shorter, but I thought that no, I should explain in a much more elaborate way. So again, thank you for giving me that extra time, Manisha, as well as participants. So it was a pleasure to be with you, to share my thoughts and to also learn from you, to hear your voice, to hear your thoughts. And I hope there will be another opportunity at some point, at some place, again to, come together and exchange ideas and discussions, right?
So on behalf of all of us, I want to say thank you, Dr. Datta. Thank you so much. I'll send the recording and I'll send the chat. Thank you. Exit. In Plains Cree, we do not say bye. We always say ex in muestas, which means that's it for now till we meet again later.
Yeah. So